Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Miskoski from the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. Welcome to today's session, Perspectives from States, the Implications of Including Chronic Absence as a Measure of Accountability. Please allow me to share some brief details about the session. Today's moderator is Hetty Chang. Hetty directs Attendance Works, a national and state-level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absence. Hetty has spent more than 2 decades working in the fields of family support, family economic success, education, and child development. In February 2013, Hetty was named by the White House as a champion of change for her commitment to furthering African American education. Today's session will last for approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes and is being recorded. We'd like to encourage you to use the chat function at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to submit questions or comments for our presenters. Please be sure to select everyone from the drop-down box to ensure that your comments and questions are seen by me and our speakers. You may submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we will leave time at the end to address as many questions as possible. If we do not have time to get through all of the questions, we will reply to all participants by email within the next 5 to 7 days. All participants have been placed on mute to avoid background noise. Please do not unmute yourself. Instead, refer to the chat function on the right side of the screen. Following the Q&A portion of our session, there will be a very brief poll. Your participation in these polls is extremely important to helping us better prepare our presentations and ensure that we are delivering content to you in a way that best suits your needs. We greatly appreciate your feedback to these questions. Before I hand the session over to Hetty, I would like to remind folks of the upcoming webinars that will be held in November. You'll find more information and a link to register for these on the last slide of the presentation. Also, I would like to share with you the mission of the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. And with that, I turn it over to Hetty Chang.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Linda. It is such a pleasure to join you here today. What I'd like to do is start off just by making sure that we all have some common background on what is chronic absence, why it matters, and how are we seeing it become part of state accountability systems. So could you turn to the next slide, please? So the first thing I just want to do, and I know that many of you may be repeat customers, this is a familiar slide, but it's really important to think about that there are multiple measures of attendance. They actually tell you different things. Chronic absence is one of them. And when you look at these multiple measures of attendance, I think one of the things that might help is to understand what question are they trying to ask and answer. Average daily attendance, which, by the way, in the past had been more used for accountability, is how many students show up every day for school. And it really gives you a sense, for example, of which days during the school year are you more likely to have challenges. Oh, the day after Halloween is problematic, or the day where there's a snow day, or the day where there's a part-day professional development activity going on for teachers. And it helps you to think about general overall patterns around attendance that might be affecting whether kids show up, or challenges that affect whether kids show up every day. Then there's truancy, which we've had a long history in this country about tracking, which is who's missing so much school without permission that they might actually need to trigger, you might want to be eventually triggering legal intervention to be able to make sure that kids comply with compulsory ed laws. And then there's chronic absence, which is who's missing so much school they're academically at risk. And honestly, Attendance Works was started in about 2010. When we first started this work, we found out that no one realized they weren't looking at chronic absence. They thought they were monitoring attendance because they looked at average daily attendance or they looked at truancy, and they didn't realize that they were actually missing, looking at who's missing so much school for any reason, including excused, unexcused, or suspensions, that they actually are academically at risk because they've missed so much instruction in the classroom. The Office for Civil Rights started producing data on how many kids are missing 15 days, which is helpful for just getting as an end-of-the-year metric and has given us a real sense of the scale and scope of the challenge. But I think what we're seeing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, that a particularly useful way of defining chronic absence is looking at missing 10% of the school year, because it allows for you to notice early on as an early warning measure when kids are just missing 2 days in the first month of school, say, so you can take action and intervene. Next slide, please. One of the things that I've seen over the past, I guess, 7 years, 8 years, is just the incredible growth in research showing that there is a real impact on attendance. This is common sense. You know, you would think if instruction in the classroom matters, that it, then matters if you're not there. But we actually didn't have as much research as one would have hoped. And over what we've seen in the last decade is an incredible growth in research that shows, even starting in pre-K, if you're chronically absent in kindergarten and pre-K, K first, by second grade, you're off track for reading, but also there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you don't show up to preschool regularly, you actually can't benefit from that high-quality instruction, and you're lower on almost every dimension of school readiness that you might imagine. As you go through both elementary and then middle and high school, chronic absence is a really good indicator. Not that there aren't other behavior and academic measures, but there's a lot to be said for just looking at attendance and alerting to kids who are actually falling off track for graduation. It's even an indication of whether kids are college and career ready. There is evidence to show that kids who are chronically absent, even if they somehow manage to graduate from high school, are less likely to enroll and then persist in college. So this is a metric that has now a real incredible base of research showing that it matters. Next slide, please. What we know is that we also know how to turn it around. And that's really, this is sort of an inverted pyramid. I know typically people see tiered support systems as the other way around. We've actually been inverting it to get people to think about that. What really improves attendance is when you have a deep, rich Tier 1 set of prevention and early intervention that's both about positive, engaging school climates so kids want to be there, as well as helping families to notice when kids are, absences are adding up to too much. And my apologies, I am in an airport, so there may be a little background noise, and hopefully that'll end soon. But you really need to have these Tier 1 interventions, and then if that's not sufficient, you want to engage in Tier 2 interventions that are much more personalized, and then engage in Tier 3 interventions. And one of the good things about chronic absence is you can actually use prior year attendance to figure out how many kids need Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3, and then plan so that you make sure that as you move into a next year or the coming school year, you actually have sufficient resources in place, given what you need in terms of this tiered support. And often when you don't have sufficient Tier 1 or Tier 2, you're almost overwhelmed by the number of kids in Tier 3. Next slide, please. What we've also seen is that how do you help people adopt these new practices around attendance is something that occurs over time. It's not overnight. And what really helps is when you can create peer learning networks, because so much of this is using data but also common sense, and then making sure that you're not always reinventing from scratch, but that you're learning from the experiences about what works as well as what doesn't work, and you're creating opportunities for communities to share with each other. We even find that peer learning networks are best when you can do them, let's say, over a course of 18-month period where they meet 3 or 4 times, and each time you're meeting to look at data, share practices, and you have a kind of piece of homework that then you can report on. And when that group meets, they also start to identify what are actions or policy challenges that really require more broader changes to affect. And then you can influence policymakers, educators, informed by what's happening at the local level, and then having that spread through technical assistance in policy. And we've seen this both work, for example, within a district where the peers are actually schools, or at a state level, you can have districts working together, or counties in California, for example, working together. And that's a really important way of creating learning and creating a change pathway that makes sure that policy and practice is grounded in what we know from localities. Next slide, please. Ultimately, what we've seen is that taking a systemic approach to reform really requires paying attention to these 5 kind of key ingredients. And this is true whether you're talking at a sort of a district level or at a state level or at a national level, but particularly district and state. On one hand, you need to have actionable data. That's accurate, accessible data that's regularly reported in a way that people can use it to figure out where they need to take action, and take action as soon as possible before kids are missing so much school that you require remediation. You want positive engagement. So when you see that something needs to happen, you're engaging students, families, teachers, schools in a positive way through relationships so that you can unpack what's going on, figure out how you can message the importance of going to school every day, and really helping motivate through positive relationships change. And you want to build capacity so people can take that actionable data and engage in that positive engagement. And you want to have shared accountability so that people can be constantly reminded and seeing that really it's everyone's responsibility to improve attendance and reduce chronic absence. And this is also a 5th ingredient, which is strategic partnerships. We know that often when chronic absence is severe, whether it's an individual who's facing severe levels of chronic absence, or it's a state or let's say a school with a high level of chronic absence, where part of what your need is actually partnerships with community members to help address the barriers, whether it's transportation or health or lack of safety, that may in fact go beyond the capacity of the school to address. Next slide, please. What we're seeing is that this is truly a watershed moment for advancing the work with the Every Student Succeeds Act. You know, we are in a huge shift in mindset that from No Child Left Behind to the Every Student Succeeds Act, where success is determined by academic and non-academic standards, not just academics, where states are setting goals and creating a supportive framework and have much more control and influence over how this plays out, where there continues to be accountability on data for student subgroups. And in the case of chronic absence, it's both a required reporting element, but it also was allowed to be an optional school quality metric that really allows states to think about another metric for looking at how are they going to improve schools. Next slide, please. And what we've seen, you know, as of September is an overwhelming interest, support for using chronic absence as a metric. I think because it really met the requirements of what makes for a good additional metric. It's reliable, it's already somewhat collected, it can be disaggregated, it's directly related to academics. And so we saw 72% of states, 36 states plus DC, adopt chronic absence as a metric. And most of these states, the vast majority, chose to take the 10% metric. Some did a kind of reverse metric, attending 90%. There's a few that still did missing a number of days, and a few using other attendance metrics. But it's been really exciting to see how this data is now going to be broadly used, and even in the states that, so for example, our colleagues in Mississippi decided not to adopt it as an accountability metric yet because they felt that they really needed to look at the data quality, which makes most sense. But they are still starting to pay attention to chronic absence because across all 50 states, there is a requirement that you report on this in your local and state report cards. So that means that this data is more available and is on the top of people's sort of radar screens in a way that has never existed before. It's quite amazing. I think there really was accountability for this officially in policy in maybe 2 states, Connecticut and California, prior to the ESSA implementation plans being due, and now we're at 72%, the vast majority of states in the country. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that we want data to be looked at is we think that when you, again, look at the levels, if you look at prior chronic absence, it can tell you something about your strategy. It can help you think about how to efficiently target and use your resources. So in this case, we actually took the 13-14 data. This is with the help of Johns Hopkins, and everyone graduates. Thank you so much, Bob and Vaughn, who were really instrumental to this work. But we were able to take that data and look at what do we know about the concentration of chronic absence. And we found that in 11%, 1 out of 10 schools, essentially, you have at least 30% or more of your kids missing 15 days or more, essentially a third of your kids chronically absent. And another 11%, 20 to 29% of kids. You know, once you reach high levels of chronic absence, so that's in 1 out of 5 schools, it both suggests that there are systemic challenges and barriers going on. It also suggests that there are that you're going to need additional community partners in there, and that this is probably really something that's requiring a lot more to get put in place those Tier 1 and Tier 2. It's a systemic issue if it's affecting that many kids. And in fact, the churn when chronic absence reaches those high levels is affecting the academic experience, not just of the kids who are chronically absent, but of the kids who are also in the classroom, and teachers are trying to deal with all that churn. So knowing that, you know, in 20% of schools you got these high levels where you're really going to have to think about how to bring in extra partnerships at a significant level, and knowing that, let's say, half your schools have less than 10% of their kids chronically absent. And so while you might need support for an individual kid, you're not necessarily looking at supports to put in place a whole comprehensive tiered support system. Next slide, please. What we saw from our data was that there was huge variations in chronic absence across states, ranging from a low of 2% to a high of 29% of all schools experiencing 30% or more levels of chronic absence. So it is really quite amazing to see the variation. We haven't had a chance to explore what that's about. How much is that about the differences in the way they collect data? How much is that about differences in maybe underlying community conditions like health and poverty? But it's really quite astonishing to see that, and it points to the need to look at your own state data, which there are we produced, and it's available on our website. Next slide, please. We also were able to look at poverty levels in schools and how that connects to chronic absence. And I just want to point out that if you look at the far left of this slide, you see that in schools where you have 75% or more of kids in poverty, you have about 19% where there's the 30% or more of their kids. So it's a high level. At the same time, it strikes me to see that there's an equal number of schools, high poverty, that have less than 5% of their kids chronically absent, which in those cases, you're both looking at where is there huge need for additional supports, and where are there maybe those bright spot schools? Because you don't get low levels of chronic absence and high levels of poverty by chance. You get that because someone was intentionally doing something. And when states look at this data, they can actually figure out which schools might be adopting practices that in fact others can use. So this is something, this is an, again, example of how you can use data strategically. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. we did see that chronic absence levels tend to be higher in high school. We also have seen there's some variation in states around this. I also want to point out that low levels of chronic absence in elementary school could be masking that you have very high levels of chronic absence K and 1, because actually second, third, fourth, and fifth tends to be the grades with the best levels of attendance. And then it starts to go up in middle and high. So this is, again, data where this helps you to understand, we do have a high school issue, but for some schools it's high in the elementary levels, and you're going to have to look at this more carefully with your own local data. Next slide, please. It's worth noticing that across the country, we really did see typically alternative schools, as well as schools with high levels of special ed experiencing extremely high levels of chronic absence. And that may be something for us all to keep in mind and think about what's happening around the educational experience of those kids. Next slide, please. So with our report, we really recommend a few things that states should do. First of all, and all states will have their data, you need to take a look at your data, review it, and think about its quality and make sure that you can see trends. And if you do need to improve quality of data, then figure out how you're going to do that. We do think it's important to form a state leadership team that's interagency, that's cross-sector, that can take a responsibility for thinking about how to organize responses and action, particularly in the places with the highest levels of chronic absence. But you really can create a data-informed comprehensive system of TA. How that'll look like is going to really have to depend upon every state. And I think it's really important for states to publicize the nature of the challenge and what are the available resources that people can turn to. So that's the section that I have for, just sharing with you some of our resources and what we have available. And it's now my pleasure to make sure that you get a chance to hear from your colleagues. So can we turn to the next slide? And I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have, it's such an incredible cross-sector of colleagues from states who represent diversity of geography in our country, diversity in size of states, diversity in the kind of infrastructure they bring. What I do know, since I've had the pleasure to work with all of these states, is that the folks in these states, these key administrators, bring passion, dedication to kids and family, that desire to make sure that every kid has an opportunity to be in school so they can learn and succeed, really cuts across each one of them. So we're going to be joined first by Dr. Susan Zellman, the Executive Director at the Ohio State Department of Education, and she'll be presenting with Brittany Miracle, who's the Program Administrator for the Center for Accountability and Continuous Improvement at the Ohio Department of Education. They have played an instrumental role in helping to make sure that Ohio started to look at its data, crunch its data, take it seriously, and start to think about how they build capacity of its districts. I'm so pleased to bring in Mary Batawala, who's the Executive Director of the Office of Accountability of the Tennessee Department of Education. She'll be presenting on Tennessee after Ohio. It's so exciting to see the Offices of Accountability starting to take this on and integrating into this work. Tennessee has just been stellar in the kind of research that it's been producing. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to be hearing from Gordon Jackson, the Director of Coordinated Student Support Services in the division at the California Department of Education, who has just been tireless in his efforts over the years to make sure that we pay attention to chronic absence school climate and making sure that there's real equitable access to education in the state of California. With that, next slide, please. Just real quick, we'll be talking about this with each one. We're going to start off with questions asking each panelist to talk about the kind of reports and data they have on chronic absence, and then I'll be asking them to share a bit how is chronic absence integrated into their ESSA work, and then how are they building chronic absence into their school improvement strategies. All right. Now I'm going to turn over to Ohio, and I'm going to ask Dr. Zellman to start us off. Tell us about the kind of reports and data that's available in Ohio on chronic absence.
Well, thank you, Hetty. It's a pleasure to be here. Ohio has been collecting data from schools and districts on chronic absenteeism, and we've been featuring it on our school and district report cards since 2014. This year, we actually went back for a report on our 2016 state report card. So we featured chronic absenteeism in our state report card report.
And Susan, I'm going to ask if they could keep moving our slides and remind you to say next slide every time you want to see one.
Okay, great. Next slide. We began to delve into our data and analyze it at the state level last year. And ESSA gave us a platform to which to use and analyze this data in ways we quite honestly didn't do before. We began talking to districts about chronic absenteeism versus average daily attendance and truancy. And on the next few slides, you're going to see how Ohio has broken down its state-level data to shine a light on student groups that we at the State Department and our districts may not have noticed. Okay, so this slide, chronic absenteeism by typology. When the data are broken down into district typologies, we can see that all typologies in Ohio have chronic absenteeism. Though we have had conversations about how to reduce chronic absenteeism in our high poverty districts, both in rural and urban areas, this data really allowed us to see that our low poverty suburban students have barriers to regular attendance as well. Although some typologies have higher rates than others, every typology can implement processes and interventions to reduce their absenteeism rates. Ohio has begun to use this data to plan and also differentiate our resources and support to our different types of districts. On the next slide, you'll see chronic absenteeism by Ohio subgroups. Disaggregating data by a subgroup shines a light on groups of students that might otherwise go unnoticed. For example, if you look at the aggregated data rate, average rate, you might not see that our students with disabilities, our migrant students, and our bilingual students, and even our gifted students are facing barriers for regular attendance. This allows us to have conversations around our state about specific reasons why students may be absent at higher rates. This intentional conversation across our department and across our state with people who are dealing with these specific categories of students, we think will lead to a better aligned system of supports at the state and at the local level. On our next slide, you will see chronic absenteeism by grade levels. Now, when we look at this data, this has been quite an eye-opening experience for us in Ohio. Though it is certainly aligned with the national research, Hetty, that you just explained, higher rates in kindergarten and other transitional grades, our rates have progressively got higher throughout the high school experience, and our high school seniors having the highest rate of absenteeism in the state. So we've been able to use this data to start conversations about how to engage our high school seniors differently. And in fact, our state superintendent today is addressing that in at least 2 of his speeches, particularly focusing in on high school seniors. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our very talented Brittany Miracle, who is working very hard on this issue. Brittany?
Thank you, Dr. Zellman. And Hetty, I think we'll head into the next question.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about how are you incorporating this into ESSA?
Sure. Our next slide will show a screenshot of our state report card. So as Dr. Zellman mentioned, Ohio has been reporting this data on school and district report cards for several years now. We do feature the district and school rate on our district and school details page, and that's what you can see on your screen right now. But we also have all school and district data in a downloadable file. It's a downloadable file that stakeholders can look at and analyze data across counties and across different regions in the state, and we're working to include disaggregated feature source subgroups in different typologies as well. The next slide will show how Ohio is integrating chronic absenteeism as part of our graded accountability system. So in addition to providing this report-only data on our report card, Ohio has committed to using chronic absenteeism as our measure of school quality or student success. Beginning with 2018, chronic absenteeism will be included as a graded measure on all school and district report cards. Ohio's report card is currently divvied up into 6 graded components, one of which is our achievement component. Within this component, we have 2 graded measures. We have an indicators met measure and a performance index. Chronic absenteeism will be included as part of the indicators met measure. Ohio is still running simulations to determine exactly how this will be calculated, but essentially it will have a benchmark data point, such as 5%, and it will also include an improvement element, such as if districts improve by 3%, or whatever improvement measure we set. If a district meets the benchmark or makes the designated amount of improvement, they will receive a check mark for the chronic absenteeism indicator within the indicators map measure on our report card. So the next slide, we can talk about how we're gearing up for chronic absenteeism as part of our school improvement system. So we've started to integrate chronic absenteeism into our continuous improvement activities. Ohio feels that an important first step is having districts look critically at their data. So schools and districts will now be asked questions about chronic absenteeism when completing the school and district needs assessment that informs their local continuous improvement plan. And this is typically the Title I plan that's required for all districts to receive federal funding. There are 2 questions in the needs assessment that populate for any district with an absenteeism rate of 5% or above. The first question, if absenteeism is concentrated among particular grade level students or subgroups in your school, think about why that is. The second question is, what is the relationship between attendance patterns and achievement? Also, what is the relationship between attendance patterns and discipline? So Ohio has a regional system of support that assists districts with these continuous improvement activities, particularly with data analysis. We're training our regional system to look at chronic absenteeism data side by side with achievement data and behavior data to get a root cause identification of why low achievement rates are persistent in some districts. In the past, districts would look at reading data and they may see that their 3rd grade reading score is low. They would dig a little deeper and they would see that certain subgroups are having trouble with 3rd grade reading. But now we're asking them to dig even a little deeper. Why are certain subgroups struggling in 3rd grade? Is it because they're not actually in the classroom benefiting from instruction, or that they're actually not attending their after-school intervention opportunities that they've been targeted for? This has started conversations within districts and schools to revisit school policies, including busing schedules, changing specific school or student schedules so that maybe reading is not first thing in the morning or math isn't first thing in the morning. And it's also started the conversation about how students are chosen for particular interventions. So once districts analyze their data to identify the root causes, they'll be asked to integrate student supports into their continuous improvement plans. These are those district level plans that I'd mentioned to get federal funding. These supports should be strategically chosen and should align with improvement activities as identified in their needs assessment. Supports should include breaking down barriers that are getting in the way to regular attendance for their students. Using data helps districts to strategically choose community partners that will help in this work. Community partners are integral to it, but we want to make sure our districts are choosing the right partners for the right reasons. Lastly, Ohio has incorporated chronic absenteeism into our model to award school improvement dollars to our focus and priority schools. As one of 4 target areas, districts may choose to spend their school improvement dollars on research. This may include a partnership with Harvard's Proving Ground project, and this project empowers districts to use attendance data as an early warning sign for chronic absenteeism.
Thank you so much. It's a wealth of information. I just want to double check that there aren't any questions. So I'm actually having trouble seeing stuff in chat. So Sue, are there any questions that you're seeing coming up about Ohio specifically? I realize we could just check if there's any clarifications about what either Dr. Zellman or Brittany Miracle just presented. Is anything coming up?
Not currently, but I would like to encourage all the participants to feel free to ask questions throughout the presentations, and we will address them either during the presentation or at the end.
Great. And Sue Fothergill is the Associate Director for Policy for Attendance Works and is helping me with this presentation. You know what I'll do is let's move on to
this particular, so because we invited the questions, we do have one. And Brittany, do you have any insights into why chronic absence rates are so high for certain subgroups, for example, students with disabilities?
I'll answer that. I mean, there could be a variety of different reasons why students with disabilities don't go to school. You know, on a very personal note, I have an autistic grandchild who is integrated into the regular classroom setting, and, you know, going to school has been hard for him because he's been bullied on the bus, and in a particular school which doesn't have a very good school climate, and receptive to students who think and act in different ways. So I think, but what I am urging is that our Office of Special Education look at this issue and also begin to disaggregate this data when it gets more refined with regard to different types of children with different types of disabilities, and see if we could address this in a more systemic and aligned way.
And similarly, just students with disabilities or migrant students, it should really be looked at on a very case-by-case student level. So even if they're having, just because they're identified as a student with disability, they're still having very personal and student-specific barriers to getting to school. So schools should still approach them very individualistically. At the state level, that's certainly a good question. And as we develop our implementation plan for ESSA, we will likely look into evidence-based strategies on getting each of these different subgroups to school and what has worked previously for the subgroup.
And also, more importantly, I mean, chronic absenteeism should be considered as part of the IEP planning process.
Absolutely.
And it's a good mechanism to address. And I do think that in terms of the guidance that our Office of Special Education issues, it's something which we will encourage them to address.
Great question. So appreciate that. I also want to offer up that you can do some bright spots analysis too to look at schools with kids with disabilities who don't have disproportionately high levels of chronic absence. And sometimes we've seen, particularly, for example, that inclusive, engaging climate, Susan, the reverse to be true. So, so appreciate all the work that you're doing on that. Why don't we shift now over to Tennessee, and we'll have our friends from Ohio stay with us so that they can answer questions at the end. But let's hear more about what's happening here in Tennessee. So tell us a bit more about what kind of reports and data do you have in Tennessee? Mary?
Sure. Thank you for having me here today. If possible, can you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll start with just a small bit of context. Most of what the speakers on the webinar thus far have shared in terms of rates for different grade levels, rates for different schools, and rates for different student groups pertains to Tennessee as well. So here's just a bit of our data. Last year, when we look at our 16-17 school year data, we saw on average in our state 13.6% of our students were chronically absent. We actually use the term chronically out of school for this. And you can see that we have certain student groups those historically underserved groups that we include in our accountability system as a focus on equity that tend to either have higher or lower rates. So the second bar there represents our racial minority students, those students that fall into the Black, Hispanic, or Native American student groups. You can see they have slightly higher rates of chronic absenteeism than all students. You can see the tallest bar there is our economically disadvantaged students with quite high rates at 21.4%. Then you'll see English learners, which actually have lower rates on average of chronic absenteeism. And then finally, as Ohio was discussing, we do tend to have slightly higher rates for students with disabilities. And this process generally has given us a chance not just to talk about chronic absenteeism and put some stakes around it, but to really engage multiple program areas, including our folks who work with students with disabilities. Next slide. So to speak specifically about the reports we provide in Tennessee, we like to think about the way we provide data to folks in two ways. And the first way, and actually to me the more exciting way, is the formative data we provide. So through our student information system at the state level, we actually have a number of standard reports and research queries that actually aggregate data that schools and districts send to us and display it back to them in ways that they can take action with. So one recent report that we just put in place over the summer is actually a by-student report that all districts and schools have access to, where they can see each one of their students as well as the total number of absences each one of their students has to date. And we actually go ahead and provide an absenteeism rate that's based on the current number of instructional days that they've been enrolled in that school so far. So we hope that folks can use this tool in two ways. The first way is that they have access to historical data. And so we hope that when they're planning for the upcoming school year, so when we launched this, it was July, and as they were planning for this current school year, we encourage folks to use this to identify students whose historical data identified them as being chronically out of school. But more importantly, it actually provides them a real-time glance at the students who are on track to be chronically absent for this school year, so that, as was mentioned earlier, they can actually see, okay, it's only been 1 month, it's August, and already the student, as of now, has an absenteeism rate of 10%. This is a student I need to flag and a student that I need to investigate further to see what types of actions I can take to make sure that they are available for direct instruction more frequently than they've currently been. So that's our first type of report. Next slide. And then we have a much more summative glance. And we provide these reports to folks in the same platform that we provide them their assessment data at the end of the year. So the report that you're looking at now is a report that we provide to districts. We provide at the district and school level. And we provide data for the previous year for all students and each one of the historically underserved subgroups that we include in our accountability system. We provide them the percent of students in each of those groups who were chronically absent in the prior year. And for districts, we actually break this out into K-8 and 9-12. So on the first line there, you can see that the percent of chronically absent in the district for all students 9 for 12 for this district was 14.8%. We then actually in the same file provide districts and schools a target to reduce this percent, which is part of what we use in our accountability system. So for this particular school, we expect them to reduce their rate by 6.25%. So we would ask that they aim to have a rate of 13% in 2018. Next slide. And actually, I think I've already said the next question.
Yep, this is about the ESSA one.
Right. So the next thing that I'm going to address is how Tennessee is approaching this data in terms of our accountability systems. And Tennessee actually has two accountability systems. The first is a district accountability system, and the second is a school accountability system. But a key thing to note is that both systems provide schools and districts multiple pathways to show success. So for schools, schools can earn a high grade because we are an A3F state by either having overall low chronic absenteeism rates or reducing the rate. So even schools with the highest rates of chronic absenteeism in our state have the opportunity to show success if they are reducing the rate at the level that we expect. And this is a metric that in our accountability system is worth 10% of a school's grade. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we have a school accountability system, but we also have a district accountability system. And this area, in order to align with our school accountability system, is also included in terms of factoring a district's final determination. So you can see here, chronically out of school is one of our 6 areas, which captures chronic absenteeism. Next slide. So here you can see that when we calculate our chronic absenteeism rates, as you saw on the data report slide, that we're not only looking at all students, we're actually looking at the performance of historically underserved subgroups as well. And these are the 4 main student groups that we include when we're factoring a school or district's determination. And the performance of these students actually counts 40% of both the district and school determinations. Next slide. So districts, like schools, have multiple ways that they can show success on this indicator, but districts actually have a third pathway that schools do not, and that's a pathway that we refer to as value added in our system. So value added is actually a metric that encourages districts to focus on those schools who have historically been chronically absent, because we know the research shows students who've been chronically absent are very likely to be chronically absent in the current year. So we're encouraging folks to look at that data, and we're actually giving them credit for reducing the percent of students who are chronically absent in the current year who were chronically absent in the prior year. We set this growth expectation off of the state, and the points assigned to districts are based off of how the state performs on this metric. So that's a really exciting additional metric that we use in district accountability, in addition to looking at absolute performance and overall reduction. Next. And finally, this slide here just gives you an overview of our school accountability indicators. And as I mentioned before, you can see here 10% of the school's determination is actually based on chronically out of school, both for K-8 and for high school.
And so how are you embedding this into your kind of school improvement systems that may be broader than just your ESSA accountability systems?
Yeah, I think having an ESSA has been really helpful in terms of putting additional weight on it, so to speak, in the minds of our schools and districts. Chronic absenteeism has an area that we've been trying to focus on for the past few years, and we actually have our program areas doing a lot of work in this area with schools. Specifically, we've been focusing on decreasing exclusionary disciplinary practice, so focusing on programs like restorative justice programs. We're actually today, our joint health committee in the state met to talk about health issues actually with school nurses, and we're looking at whether or not we're adequately funding those positions. So we definitely have been approaching this from multiple angles, because we know that the underlying causes of chronic absenteeism can vary from place to place and student to student, but we definitely see chronic absenteeism as a leading indicator when it comes to schools and school outcomes. And it's specifically an important indicator that we think about when we think about equity, because we know that gaps, like you saw at the state level for Tennessee, like you saw in Ohio, those gaps in this leading indicator ultimately represent gaps in our outcomes as well. And so it's one area that we really think if we push around, and by adding it into our accountability system, we're getting a little bit more traction, we're really going to be able to see improvements in achievement in those other things that matter for students and student outcomes.
Thank you. There are 2 questions that we've seen so far. One is about disaggregated data for students of color, and another is about what you do. I wanted to let the audience know we're actually going to come back to that as a cross-cutting conversation, but giving everyone a heads up on the panel that I'm going to, after we hear Gordon share about California, I'm going to come back and talk about this issue of disaggregated data for students of color and population specific, as well as have you guys share what you've been, if you've seen any examples of particularly effective approaches to reducing chronic absence. But that's a little infomercial for the end. And before I do that, I actually want to turn this over to Gordon Jackson, because the California Department of Education, I think, represents a different approach, in part because California is such a large state, and I think the situation of trying to move and address this issue has emerged a bit differently given the environment. So Gordon, give us a sense of California and how this issue of chronic absence has been emerging here.
That would be my pleasure, Hetty, and it's great to have this opportunity with everyone, and I'm so impressed in listening to both Ohio and Tennessee to look at the progress that they've made, and it's inspirational in the best of ways. I think the California story is an interesting story, and I think to put it in context, it's important to recognize that our state's population is larger than either Canada or Australia, and that the 6.2 million kids that make up our system are incredibly diverse. When we think about the role of the State Department and how we, intervene and interact with our system, 10,500 schools makes it a little bit limiting when it comes to going out and actually having dialogue and having direct work with schools. We have 58 county offices. We work more directly with our county offices, fully recognizing that we have over 1,000 school districts. So all of this is to say this is quite a system that calls for kind of an intricate way of working together to make it work. Next slide, please. I think it's also important to note that, we have had quite a trail, and it's been, I think, a real emphasis on the part of my division and my work in the department with amazing colleagues is to truly make chronic absence matter so that folks understand that all the resources, all the great things that you're providing our students are going to have very little impact if, in fact, the seats are empty. In 2010, we had Senate Bill 1357, which finally defined a chronic absentee and really put things in motion to look at our longitudinal data system to start recognizing we need data, we need to move forward with this. In 2011, the state superintendent convened a chronic absenteeism policy forum, and that was a really critical step because we invited agency leads and other key individuals, including legislators, together in one room to talk about chronic absence and to talk about its impact, and really that was the beginning of all of our messaging to make it matter and to, more importantly, make it matter to everyone in all of these different walks in the student's life. In 2013, we had a local control funding formula enter our lives, which was huge, just dynamically changed how funding happens in California, how school funding happens, and really provided, I think, the impetus to start looking at it's great to recognize that chronic absence matters, but what do you do with that? How do you measure it? How do you help it to become a part of accountability? And we've done that. Next slide. So the local control funding formula includes this companion piece, which is called the Local Control Accountability Plan. It's a 3-year plan that describes the goals, actions, and services and expenditures to support positive student outcomes that address state and local priorities. So schools and districts are obligated to create this plan, and that plan must make reference to these priorities. And fortunately, because of those of us who sit where I sit that are just totally committed to making the difference about chronic absence, we're pleased that pupil engagement, that attendance rates, chronic absenteeism rates, dropout rates, graduation rates are a part of this plan, are a part of the priorities, and in essence, districts and schools have to actually write that out. What are going to be the goals? What's going to be?
Hey, Gordon, we're hearing a comment that we need you to speak a little louder in the mic, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay, sure. And so, which is rare for me, and that's okay. So, next slide, please. So as we start looking at this path to California's efforts to really address chronic absenteeism, the superintendent convened a second chronic absenteeism policy forum in 2013, much like the first, again, working with some of our colleagues, working with the California Endowment, working with legislators, working with agency leads to really help them to start looking at what is it that they might do to contribute. How might they message throughout all of, to their constituents that having your child in school matters. In 2016, the State Board of Education announced that the local control funding formula evaluation rubrics would include chronic absenteeism rates. So as you can imagine, there was a celebration in my division because that was an opportunity to make this real. And in 2017, just not too long ago, in September, our state board approved California's Every Student Succeeds Act plan, and it includes chronic absenteeism as a part of the accountability index for pupils in kindergarten through 8th grade. So this is a great beginning. Next slide. So we start looking at what's next. In the spring of 2016-17, the 2016-17 school year, chronic absent rates were collected, and now through our longitudinal data system, we have to review that. We have to spend the time to really understand the results and review that data, and to complete that as soon as possible, early in this school year, to help us then determine the baseline and establish some of the associated goals. This is new for California. It was new for our districts and schools to really look at this data, to have it accessible. Then ultimately,
hey, Gordon, can I offer just a little context, which is that, so one of the things that people may not know about California is California has been funded by average daily attendance for years. So in 2010, when Gordon was talking about how we had to have legislation defining chronic absence and suggesting it would be added to our longitudinal student database, the issue was most states have attendance in their longitudinal student data systems, but they weren't calculating chronic absence. So for example, both Ohio and Tennessee, that was their situation. They had the data, they hadn't been calculating it. In California, and there's a handful of other states for whom they're just starting to add attendance data in it. We actually didn't even have the data in the system in order to be able to crunch numbers. So I just want to make sure that people, because we have a national audience, and in fact, part of the problem in California was that when people knew that we were funded by average daily attendance, where districts were sending up to the state every month, you know, here's how many kids showed up every day, they assumed that we had it, when that was actually district level data and not individual student level data. So this is a huge step forward for California, and given that we're also about 10% of the country, I think it's a huge step forward for the country.
Absolutely, and thank you for spotlighting that, Hetty. Absolutely. So now that we have this data, and we're going to be able to look at it in DataQuest, one of our systems that display data, and a new California school dashboard, there's this high connection to accountability, obviously, and there's this opportunity for us to really look at where are the pockets of concern, where are the promising practices, you know, where are there ways in which we can intervene and assist, and most importantly, drawing attention to who is more often than not chronically absent. California is a diverse state. You know, the majority of our 6.2 million students are students of color. And when we start disaggregating the data and looking at the data, it's very clear who more often than not is chronically absent. And therefore, when we're thinking about strategies and what to do, that has to be a part of the mix in terms of deliberate things that we do, you know, for some of our underserved students. Next slide, please. So as we've now recognized that it's a part of ESSA, and ESSA's requirement was a wonderful thing that just really kind of cinched the deal for California, that in essence, that expectation on the part of ESSA to really use chronic absenteeism was a benefit to us. So we're looking now at aligning their strategies and looking at some real concrete things that we can do. We have state school attendance a review board that is providing statewide guidance to our superintendent and to my staff about things that they're doing in their own districts, as well as giving us trends and giving us information that's critically important, helping us look at policy, helping us look at what might need to be reviewed and revisited. We have a model SARB recognition program that encourages the development of new strategies. You know, in a system such as ours, we fully recognize that there are people that are ready to move forward and collaborate and cooperate after we've really done our due diligence to make attendance matter and chronic absenteeism matter. But what they need more often than not is, and so what do I do? You know, what are the strategies? What are some of the things that I can do? So having model SARBs that go through this process of really working with both the leadership of the school, the parents, and the student to determine why this student is absent and going through this process also influences some of the very programs that schools and districts are using and modeling to really make the difference. We have a SARB handbook that we disseminate that provides these effective practices, and so that's incredibly important. Next slide. You know, we know that it matters. In 2016, we had 27 school districts that were recognized for their best practices in improving school attendance. And the Attendance Institute estimates that if all California districts use best practices consistently, what a difference it would make, in fact. And the number of chronically absent students in California in grades kindergarten to 5th would drop. We know in just a recent mining of that data that Latino students in these best attendance practice districts graduated at a rate of 87.2%, which is 7.2% higher than the average of our Latino students, you know, in the state. African American students, they in those best attendance practice districts graduated at a rate of 85.2%, which was 12.6 above the state average. So we recognize that it makes a difference. We publicize this. We communicate this in every venue possible so that we're working with leadership so that they can say, well, I want that too. I want to make that happen. And in many ways, you know, working with improving attendance is perhaps some of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to all of the different things that one's trying to do in a school system. This is highly doable. Next slide. Our superintendent has said on many occasions, you can have the best facilities, the best teachers, and the best curriculum in the world, but none of that matters if students are not in school, and that's our elected superintendent, Tom Torlakson. My division is in the process of developing additional web-based assistance to support schools and districts with chronic absence data mining. It's going to be a lot easier now that there's ready access to data, so that's a plus. But most importantly, it's what do we do with this data, and then that next step, and how does that show, how is that evidenced in the daily operations of a school? We're in the process of developing a state system of support, and that's, as you can imagine, quite comprehensive and quite complicated in a state the size of California. But one of the things that will include will be some of the deliberate interventions, the deliberate modeling and examples and guidance about what to do. When you've recognized that you have this high rate of chronic absence, you are convinced that it matters and you have definitely joined that team. We don't want people to spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about their own customized way of doing things if, in fact, we can provide them examples and samples and models to make the difference. So it's exciting. It's been a long haul. I know that 5 years from now, if not sooner than that, we'll have real clear, data to show about our progress and really looking far more sophisticated than we are now because we're just getting to that point. But I'm very pleased that we have moved in this direction.
Thank you so much, Gordon. So let's go into some of these cross-cutting questions. I'm going to first ask a question and then bring back our friends from Ohio and Tennessee as well. What kind of disaggregated data do you have in your systems? And then I want to ask an open question and involve Gordon in that, and saying, what are you finding is needed to to tailor strategies to particular populations. So first, let me ask both first Ohio and then Tennessee, what kind of disaggregated data you have? So it's not just students of color as a lump, but specific within that.
Well, we do look now at disaggregation of data by different types of students, and we have individual student data so that we could look at it at a district level and at a school level per student. And one of the things I'm trying to encourage as we think about a State Department of Education for the 21st century is to really build a stronger research planning and evaluation unit within our department that would actually work with districts and bring in people with data visualization skills and so forth to really train them on how to look and report on that data, and that when we look at the data collaboratively, we would use either national best practices, or we would then sort of collect those experiences and link it to our work in other centers in the department to see what we can, in fact, improve upon with regard to our policies or issues that we need to alert them to. So our philosophy, Hetty, is really sort of creating a creative tension between top-down and bottom-up types of policy making and work in partnership with our districts.
Thank you. Can we, by the way, move to the just questions slide? That would be really helpful. So, Tennessee, are you disaggregating below the BHN category, and are you able to kind of look at what's working for particular ethnic populations?
Yes, actually we are. We disaggregate for each individual racial and ethnic group, and we actually use that in calculating our targeted support schools. So while we use the combined group largely in our system for lots of pieces of our state accountability system, we do look specifically at each of those groups. And when we break it out, we see similar trends to what we see in terms of achievement. Our Hispanic students tend to have lower chronic absenteeism rates than our Black students, and Native Americans have lower rates as well. We do that combining largely to include as many students as possible in our accountability system. But yes, we definitely at it.
And Gordon, you talked about some of your districts with particularly good, better results. Do you have a sense of what they're doing?
You know, I do, and I think that part of it is that they're looking at kind of a comprehensive approach. They're focused on, of course, student discipline reform, because those absences and suspension or whatever it may be that is creating this learning loss is in essence adding to chronic absence. So looking at reforming their discipline policies so that students aren't out of school, looking at working with the home, and particularly, especially in California, working with the home in the home language so that parents are brought on board, you know, fully understanding their level of support and fully understanding, you know, the overall concept of chronic absence, that it's absence for any reason, and scheduling doctor's appointments differently and all of that, and making sure that that conversation happens in a language that they really understand. And I think it's also just working with the whole notion of school climate and school engagement and equity are all very much connected to chronic absence. And so that when you're having that dialogue and when you're working with schools and districts that talk about their commitment to all students and their commitment to the whole child, well, that commitment falls asunder if, in fact, they have high rates of chronic absenteeism and they're not making that connection. So it's really fortifying all of that to build the team to recognize that we got to walk the talk, and here are some real concrete things that you can do to really turn that around.
Thank you. So I have another question here, which is, and maybe I'll start again with Ohio and keep going in this direction, which is, what are the steps that are needed to help districts transition from truancy and sort of a punishment modality to chronic absence early intervention? And how are you trying to foster that approach as a state?
So the first step, at least when I'm working with districts, is having them understand that excused or unexcused doesn't really matter. It matters if the student is not in the classroom. In Ohio, we've been helped out with this because we do have new state legislation that has shifted the conversation away from the punitive truancy approach to a more individualized student-centered approach. So now when students are truant, any district with a chronic absenteeism rate of 5% or above has to have an absence intervention team at their school or district. So we've found that that's particularly helpful in districts thinking through why students are missing school, not just that they are, but why are they missing school and what resources can help that student and that family break down those barriers to attendance. We found that to be particularly helpful.
Mary, what about Tennessee?
Yes. I like what Gordon said in terms of making connections, because we're really trying to help folks make connections and understand that chronic absenteeism is ultimately impactful when it comes to student achievement. And like I said, the reasons that students miss, are diverse, and we have a great program area that's actually working with supporting students and supporting schools. And I think you mentioned it earlier, when you look at your data, you do come to find those places that are bright stars or lighthouses, and those are the places we've actually tried to locate in Tennessee and use as exemplars to hold up and say, yes, this is hard work, and yes, this takes time, but ultimately, whatever the cause is of chronic absenteeism, there actually are some interventions that you can use. And I think the data pieces really are important, particularly for our smaller districts that, don't have the ability to look at and aggregate all of their data. And I'll say that in Tennessee, we don't necessarily look at chronic absenteeism data as by itself actionable, but we do think it can lead our districts and schools to ask questions that will ultimately lead them to take action. And we have great examples of our districts doing that in recent years, and I'm really hoping that as this becomes a more talked about metric, as it's an accountability, we're going to see even more of that.
Great, thank you so much. Gordon, what would you add to this? What have you found has been crucial to moving the dialogue from truancy and a sort of more court intervention or even a sort of more punitive approach, which isn't always, you can do courts that aren't punitive, but that kind of modality to more of a prevention approach?
I think the one thing that I've noticed that has made the difference, I think, is really working with those individuals that are closest to the child, and that is the teacher. And when the teacher has strategies that really create more student engagement, when the teacher has strategies about how to greet that student that has been absent and is now returning in ways that really motivate that student to want to come the next day, what's helpful is for the student, for the teacher to realize that ultimately it allows them to do their job easier. The classroom is not disrupted as much. The flow of instruction, the continuity of their efforts. I mean, ultimately, it becomes the gift that the teachers are saying, I had to do a little extra in terms of paying attention to it, in terms of messaging to the family and to the child about being here and doing that piece, but the end result is the reward that it makes my job easier. And so that is truly, I think, something that I want to spread through every classroom and in every school and district, so that no one looks at attention to this issue becomes yet one more burden or one more thing to do, when in essence it's the foundation which makes lots of other things happen far more easier in a school.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I I have one last question, and we're going to have to keep it short, so I'll see who would be volunteering. But I'm actually wondering, Mary, if you might offer on this one, and maybe it's because I've spent a little time in your state in Appalachia. How have you seen that you need to take and tailor this work to rural areas? And then we'll see if we have time to let anyone else, but I know in particularly that's a big piece of Appalachia. Appalachia is a big piece of the work that you do.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Actually, you know, Tennessee, most of our districts, 96 of them, have 5,000 or fewer students, so we're dealing with a lot of rural districts. But actually, although being rural can sometimes seem like a disadvantage, there's actually a lot of advantages that they have. The things that Gordon was talking about, those personal relationships and the sense of community, in some ways there are strategies that we've seen these districts take that wouldn't be possible in some of our more urban districts because of the personalization. So I'll just give one anecdote briefly. We had one of our smaller districts just get a decal printed like school, you know, absenteeism officer and slap it on one of their cars. And even though they didn't even have the money to employ that type of person, they just drove it around town. And just the mere presence of having that made parents, you know, start talking about how they're going to start actually monitoring attendance more, and that increased their attendance rate. So we have all those great types of anecdotes, but most of them are really driven and based off of the personalization that people are able to take into consideration when they tailor their strategies for these smaller rural communities.
That really brings us to the end of our time. We do want to thank everyone so much for attending today, and also thank our presenter and our panelists for their insight and expertise. We're going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, to please stay on the webinar to participate in just a few quick polling questions that are related to this session. Thank you so much.
Don't worry. Thank you.